Good afternoon, everybody. Today is December 8th, 2022, and welcome to our 35th live online iGeriCare event. And today's topic is the Driving and Dementia Roadmap. We'll spend the first part of today's session with an overview of the new Driving and Dementia Roadmap website, and followed by time for any questions related to the topic for our guest experts. Please feel free to submit any questions through the chat bot if you're watching the live event through the iGeriCare website, or you can also submit it through the comments in Facebook or YouTube if you're watching through those channels. So just a short bit of background. Dementia is a disease of the brain that can make driving risky, yet some people still drive in the mild or early stages. Because of the progressive nature of the disorder, it's critical to be aware of any changes with driving. So retiring from driving, also known as driving cessation, is one of the first and toughest issues that many families, people with dementia, and care partners encounter. Because driving is so important in the lives of most people, a new website was developed to help people make some of these difficult decisions and transitions with respect to driving and dementia. So I'm very, very pleased today to have as guests the co-creators of the Driving and Dementia Roadmap website, Drs. Mark Rapoport and Gary Naglie. Dr. Rapoport is a geriatric psychiatrist and professor at University of Toronto and the acting head of geriatric psychiatry for Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto. His main area of research focuses on motor vehicle collisions associated with neurological and psychiatric illness in older adults. And Dr. Gary Naglie is a geriatrician and professor in the Department of Medicine and the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto. He's the VP of Medical Services and Chief of Staff and Chief of the Department of Medicine at Baycrest Health Sciences, and is also an associate scientist at Baycrest's Rotman Research Institute. And his research focuses on driving issues in older adults with cognitive impairment and dementia. So a warm iGeriCare welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So Gary, I'll let you kick it off and give us a bit of an overview with respect to the topic of driving and dementia and the Driving and Dementia Roadmap.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for that very warm welcome, and we are delighted to be here today. I'd just like to begin by recognizing that Mark and I have co-led its development, but part of a much larger research team that included colleagues across the country and our research associates, assistants, and research trainees as well. And of course, we have to acknowledge the funders that help support this. Primarily the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, supported by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and Partners, as well as by the Centre for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, housed out of Baycrest, and the Ontario Ministry of Health. And a particular special thanks to the Alzheimer's Society. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with numerous Alzheimer's societies across the country, who played a major role in helping with the development and early sort of testing and feedback of the roadmap. So we'll begin with a bit of background on driving and dementia and a little bit about the development of the roadmap, and then Mark is going to give you a tour of the roadmap. So as I suspect the audience is aware, driving cessation, stopping to drive, is a complex, challenging, and very emotion-laden process for people living with dementia, their family carers, and as well as for their health care providers. And there's sort of two elements to this. There's making the decision to stop driving, but then transitioning to giving up driving, which is critically important and can be difficult. I guess, as Anthony quite rightly pointed out, in the later stages, moderate and more severe stages of dementia, driving is really not an option, that the impairment associated with the dementia during those stages is severe enough that it impacts driving to the extent that people can no longer drive. But it's in the mild form where some people remain safe to drive, and where the challenge is working with the person with dementia, their family, and the health provider at determining when do they sort of cross that threshold where they're no longer safe to drive. And just to put some context to this, there have been many studies that have compared the driving performance in people with dementia compared to people who do not have dementia. And they very consistently have shown that people with dementia have more problems with road rules, more problems with lane maintenance, sort of staying between the lines in which you're supposed to drive, making safe lane changes, making turns, especially left-hand turns across traffic, maintaining road speed, stopping appropriately, and avoiding collisions. And often when people ask about red flags, these are the things that I speak to the person with dementia and their family members to observe carefully when they're driving, as early signs that maybe their driving skills are diminishing and they're no longer safe. They've also been shown to have less ability to attend and focus when driving, and have slower decision making. As I've alluded to, driving performance decreases with the increased severity of the dementia. And 6 of 10 studies that primarily looked at more mild to certainly early moderate dementia found that drivers with dementia crashed more often than controls, anywhere from 2 to 10-fold more often. And 15 to 65% failed on-road driving assessments. One of the issues that Mark and I really want to emphasize is much of our early work in developing the roadmap and identifying areas to sort of focus on is identifying the emotional impact of driving cessation is extremely high. And this slide talks about the emotional impact for people with dementia. Loss of driving can impact the person with dementia's sense of identity and their self-worth. And driving is a lot more than getting from point A to point B. So driving is connected to a sense of freedom, independence, and control. Often their role of that person in terms of taking care of their spouse, children, grandchildren is tied into driving. It's associated with work and livelihood, and associated with enjoyment. I mean, some people just actually enjoy driving as an activity. And the resulting emotions can be many, including things like loss, sadness, grief, fear and anxiety, depression, frustration, guilt, anger, often directed at family members and health providers. There's also a very significant emotional impact on family, friend, carers. Feelings of loss, sadness, and grief, feelings of fear and anxiety, how to cope with the person with dementia's emotions going through having to give up driving, and for family members with dementia who are still driving, often a fear of vehicle collisions. There can be feelings of frustration, anger, and guilt, especially when the person with dementia is experiencing things like denial, intense sadness, withdrawal, and anger. Sometimes the carer can feel discouraged and powerless when the person with dementia insists on continuing to drive when their health provider has told them that they're no longer safe to drive. And then finally, often feeling overwhelmed with added responsibilities of having to take over transportation responsibilities and making driving arrangements for the person with dementia. So we undertook to develop the driving and dementia roadmap with the idea of developing a resource to support people with dementia, family carers, and health providers in the decision-making and transitioning to stopping to drive. And we did a variety of interviews and focus groups with people with dementia, carers, and other stakeholders. And we identified that there's a lack of understanding about the relationship between dementia and driving, which we just talked about. We clearly identified that no one likes to talk about driving cessation issues. This certainly includes people with dementia, it includes carers, but it also includes health providers because of the tremendous emotion that's elicited when this topic is discussed. We noted that addressing the emotional effects of driving cessation, as we just pointed out, are as important as attending to the practical aspects. And we noted that family friend carers need support in their role of maintaining purpose, roles, and social participation of people with dementia. And finally, we identified that resources are often difficult to access, and the credibility of those that are found can be difficult to determine. So we undertook a process where we identified all publicly available resources and tools and that addressed the issue of driving cessation. And we undertook to assess all of these based on evidence, relevance, and usability to bring them forward in the roadmap. We do want to point out that we had an advisory group of people with lived experience. This included 4 people living with dementia and 4 family carers who were involved throughout the process in advising us on the content and the design of the website. And I'm now going to turn things over to Mark to get to the exciting part, as he will give us a tour of the roadmap.
Perfect. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, Anthony and group for having us join. We really want people to use this website. Gary has nicely outlined the challenges and how we've developed this website and why. I'm going to show you how the website works and hope that you'll use it. The first step would be to type in drivinganddementia.ca into your browser. And that brings you to our landing page, and you could see the main point is support for the driving with dementia journey. And then there are 3 main portals. One is for people who have dementia, one is for family and friend carers, and one is for healthcare providers. If you're someone with dementia or a family friend carer, you would then indicate whether the person you're caring for is still driving or is no longer driving if you're a family friend carer, and if you have dementia yourself, you would indicate the same. So let's say you're someone with dementia and you're still driving. So you would click on this part of the website, and that brings you to a page about I have dementia and I'm still driving. And there's a menu of items that you might be interested in learning about. How does dementia affect my driving? Recognizing when it becomes unsafe to drive. How can I get help to decide to stop driving? How do I get around without driving? Deal with the emotions and learn about licensing and reporting and transportation options. We've highlighted these areas because I'll show you a little bit more about that. So recognizing when it becomes unsafe to drive. If you click on that, there's some information about information and tips about how you might recognize this. You could click on any of these to learn more things about assessing your driving, learn how others assess your driving. And then there's a video. This one in particular was created by the Alzheimer's Association in the United States. And it's a video in which a daughter and mother discuss the possibility of the mother needing a driving assessment, and also talking about other ways that the mother who has dementia may be able to get around if she can't do well on that driving assessment. Getting help to decide whether or not to stop driving. We have some information about talking to someone you trust. How do you talk to your doctor about this? There are some worksheets. We provide 5 of them actually. And here's an example of one, the Driving and Dementia Decision Aid from Australia. If you click on that, it opens up this decision aid, which we got permission to share with you. And that helps you decide and weigh your options about continuing to drive or stopping driving, and make sure that you're informed about all the various options. So back to the main page, let's say you're someone with dementia who is no longer driving, and there's a lot of issues that come up in that circumstance, as Gary alluded to. So you click on that, you might want to understand, why did I have to stop driving? How do I get around without driving? How do I deal with my emotions? And then the other licensing and transportation issues that come up. So if you click on getting around without driving, there are some ideas here about, think of all the places you could go, and then see if any of these options would work for getting there. So this is about alternate transportation, consider changing some of your routines. And there's a video and there's some worksheets. Here's one of the worksheets, an alternative transportation. One of the things we try to teach all of our patients and family members is that we don't want the spouse to be the only transportation plan. And that happens far too often. So we want to encourage people to think about who else other than the spouse, what other family members, friends, private services, taxi services can be put in place to help with some of these needs that are now no longer met by driving the car. So let's say you're a family or friend caring for someone with dementia who is still driving. Again, there's very similar points here, but we have some additional topics about having conversations about giving up driving, managing when the person with dementia won't stop driving. So having conversations, we have also some worksheets. There's one conversation planner that we show here about how do you plan this conversation. And by the way, usually these conversations evolve over a period of time. It's not one conversation, but it's a variety of different conversations about the same issue. So there are planners. There are also videos on this page that people can access. If the person with dementia that you're caring for won't stop driving, there are some ideas and videos or a video that we provide about how to talk to someone who's really reluctant and very angry about the idea of stopping driving. Most people with dementia are very careful drivers and they're very conscientious. Some people, though, lack insight, and it's very hard for them. They say, I've always been a good driver. I have no problems driving, even after they've had an accident, which they may actually have forgotten about. A family friend care, if you're a family friend care, giving care to someone who is no longer driving, there are some emotions are a topic that are very key and come up again and again. And so we have some text provided about recognizing the emotional needs that driving fulfills, cope with the emotional impact on me as a caregiver, the emotional impact on the person I'm caring for. There is a worksheet about not going it alone, who can offer support, and creating a circle of support so that it doesn't all fall to the spouse. If you're a healthcare providers often want to know about assessing fitness to drive. Many of them do know, but some of them don't. We want them to also learn about having these discussions and managing emotion, providing support after their person stops driving, and learning about licensing, reporting, and transportation options. So this text is more for healthcare professionals, and it outlines a step-by-step approach that they may use. We only share this to you today. Most of you will not be healthcare providers, but you can access the healthcare provider portal and see what healthcare providers might be going through when they're doing these assessments. And they also have similar information about reporting and licensing. And we created this on a province by province basis so that you can find out information in your own province about the legal requirements for healthcare professionals to report dementia diagnosis. So we've had some quotes from people who've used the website already, and family carer told us that it's helping to monitor the person with dementia more. I'm going to make sure that every few months I go in the car with her or follow her and talk to her about it on a regular basis. A person with dementia said that the DDR, Driving Dementia Roadmap, made me realize there's an end to driving somewhere in the future. Actually, I hadn't even thought of it. Somewhere along the line, I know I've got to stop. And a family carer said that the website gave me a little bit of hope that together as a team with my siblings, we can figure out a plan. So some key tips for family caregivers that are embedded in the website, but I just want to highlight them for us today. Dementia does have a negative effect on many driving skills. Eventually, all people with dementia will have to stop driving in order to avoid motor vehicle crashes. But stopping driving is difficult. It's difficult from an emotional point of view, from a practical point of view, and this can be devastating for people with dementia and their families. If your relative has a mild dementia, watch them while driving. Look out for red flags. Some of the red flags are on the website, and Gary presented them earlier, and help them plan ahead. Planning ahead is much better than having them arrive at a doctor too late when they already have a more severe dementia. If your relative has a more severe dementia, it's time for them to stop driving. Usually it's for sure by the severe stage, and generally by the moderate stage, it's too late. And that's why we have this website. We want to be proactive and help people make those decisions and stop driving with dignity, and so that they take an active role in this. If you're a family caregiver, you want to approach the issue of driving with sensitivity. We've all heard conversations where people say, that's it, you just have to stop, forget it, let's not talk about it anymore. That we have to have some sensitive ways to discuss it. The website shows some examples of how to do that. Involve healthcare professionals in your discussions about driving with dementia. Ensure that you have a plan for transportation involving more than the spouse that ensures continued mobility after the person with dementia stops driving. And finally, please use the website. The website has tools and resources for you, your family members, the person with dementia, to help make decisions about stopping driving. And then once driving stops, continuing to have a good life, a good quality of life after driving stops. And with that, fantastic. I thank you. If you have questions, we'll open it up at this point.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you both for that overview. And it's a outstanding and comprehensive resource. So it's a great thing for the iGeriCare audience to know about. We have some viewer questions that have come in. I wanted to I guess follow up on some of the tips that you were recommending. If you had some specific advice, I guess, for family carers who might be accompanying the person, with cognitive impairment to an appointment with their healthcare provider, what are some of the things that a family member, might discuss with a healthcare provider at an appointment that would be helpful as part of, I guess, your assessment of fitness to drive?
So Gary and I may have a different approach to this. This is what's interesting. So what I typically do is I encourage the family member to come in separately. Not just about driving, because all sorts of things may be said, and most people take to that fairly well, and it allows the family member to be very frank with me about concerns that they may not feel comfortable sharing if their person with dementia that they love is in the room with them, because that's very dicey. So that I encourage that, and then I encourage a frank discussion about driving and red flags. I always want to know, how often do you observe the driving? Are you sharing from actual experience or just from theoretical concern and worry about the person with dementia's driving?
And Anthony, if I can just add, I think a critically important point is studies that have been done have shown that family members' concern about the person with dementia's driving skills is strongly associated with driving outcomes. Contrary to that, family members feeling that their family member with dementia is a good driver, or the person with dementia's view that they're a good driver, is very poorly correlated with driving outcomes. And all this is meant to say is that getting the input from a family member who's observed the driving of the person with dementia, because I have many children of people with dementia who come to me and tell me, you have to get my dad off the road. And I said, well, when's the last time you actually drove with your dad? 2 years ago. So, my responsibility is to my patient. And of course, I can't be basing that on, a child's, maybe paternalistic concerns as opposed to observed driving. And then, as Mark said, is I literally go through those red flags with them. I one by one and say, have you observed them having difficulty with any of these things? That really helps me get a sense of whether the cognitive impairment has reached a point that it's influencing their ability to drive. And I guess lastly, I will ultimately take responsibility for any decision, for example, about stopping to drive, as opposed to the family member, and being very clear that this is, in my mind, it's a medical assessment that I'm trained to do, and that I am making the decision to try to remove opportunities for the person with dementia placing blame on their family member for an outcome that they don't want to face.
That's great. Thank you both. One of the other scenarios that I think is particularly challenging, I guess there's several. One of them is the scenario where a spouse and a person with dementia are sort of living together, and the spouse does not drive. So they are, in fact, highly dependent on the person with dementia as the driver. And I guess the other scenario that is similar to that is people who might live either in rural areas, or I would also argue that many suburban areas are sort of equally really set up for driver friendliness. And I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit about advice or just points of perspectives, I guess, on some of the challenges for dementia family carers in those scenarios.
So thank you for that important question, Anthony. I'll start, and I'm going to hand it off to Mark to talk about the rural question, because Mark and I have given quite a bit of thought to this. But your first point about perhaps a spouse who doesn't drive, who's very dependent on the person with dementia's driving. So that's one of the reasons, for example, why a spouse's comment that there's no concerns about driving can't always be depended on, because in that circumstance they have a conflict of interest, obviously. But I think the important point is you have to understand that context, because when we talk about arranging for transportation alternatives, in that scenario, what you're also bearing in mind is you need to create transportation plans that's going to support the family member as well, right? So when Mark presented this notion of developing a transportation plan, in this instance, you're creating a transportation plan not only for the person with dementia, you're creating a transportation plan that will also be able to support the carer who's going to lose their primary source of transportation. So I think that's an important point of emphasis, and making sure that you know that fact, because you're viewing the person with dementia as your patient. But frankly, I've always viewed this circumstance as a dyad. Like, I always consider the person with dementia is my true patient, but I view the carer and the person with dementia as my responsibility to have an understanding of and to create planning for. And Mark, do you want to talk a bit about some of the discussions we've had about the issue of rural having to give up driving in rural areas?
Yeah, ideally, we will eventually develop a rural pages on the website, because this is the hard, really, really hard. Yeah. First of all, on a positive, I'm going to first talk about the positive aspects about rural. The roads on rural streets are much less complex. They are straight lines. It's not a lot of lane changes, not a lot of left turns. They're monotonous, easy drives. Getting lost is more difficult, so that's a positive. Another positive is that there are very tight-knit, caring communities who live in rural. They take care of each other in rural areas, and so that can help those things can help buffer some of the issues. On the other hand, dementia, the effects of dementia on driving are fairly similar between urban and rural drivers. Past a certain point, people will become unsafe to drive on rural and urban roads. And compounding things even more is that we do not have good alternate transport. There's no Uber, there's no Lyft in rural areas. In fact, in some rural areas, you may not even be able to access our website because there's no broadband internet. This is a web-based resource, so you may not even be able to get on the internet in some areas. So there are definitely specific challenges. We don't have a lot of solutions, certainly, about the alternate transportation problem. In the United States, there are some very innovative. There's an innovative program where people trade services, where a family member, for example, living in Florida, could, in exchange for having someone drive their relative in New York to a doctor's appointment, they may donate certain, they may be able to pay a certain amount of money or do a favor, a barter down in Florida to some older adult and have their parent driven to a doctor's appointment in New York. But that type of infrastructure, as far as I've seen, has never gotten into a rural zone.
Yeah. So thank you both very much. So I have there's a few other questions, but there was something else that occurred to me the other day with newer urban planning. I don't know if your streets are the same issues are happening in the areas where you live, but I find in and around Hamilton, Ontario, McMaster, and also I was in Montreal recently. It seems like the urban landscape for drivers has gotten more complex. Bicycle lanes, sometimes parking, like lanes all of a sudden become narrowed for parking. I'm wondering if there's any more recent data on some of the challenges for people with early stages of dementia or mild cognitive impairment who may still be driving, because it strikes me that it's actually more complex. The cognitive load is higher. The bike lanes add another serious risk for fatality from unexpected. I'm just wondering if there's been any data on some of these ideas to encourage active transport that may actually make it harder for people with dementia to drive.
Yeah, well, you've just so I'm not aware of any data about that, but I can tell you that you've highlighted one of the key points that comes up in my office all the time. People say, "Well, I only drive to the store, so I should be okay. I'm not going on highways. I'm not going, so no problem." Well, not going on highway means that you won't have you'd be less likely to have a multi-vehicle high-speed collision that kills a lot of people. That's good. But on the way to the store, there's a school. There's which is increasingly complicated to avoid with their avoiding that, and then these more complicated road environments with bike lanes, navigating that can become particularly challenging in urban areas. And then I also tie that into technology. People wonder, won't these self-driving vehicles, all these new bells and whistles that the new cars have, where they beep and they tell you, they help you stay in the lane, they help you brake. Correct, there are some positives, but they also can be extremely distracting and alarming when you're not looking out for them. We are doing a study. If anyone has a relative with dementia that lives in the Toronto area and wants to drive a very high tech driving simulator, where we welcome them to join our study of autonomous self-driving vehicles, where we're looking to see how people with dementia navigate those circumstances.
Anthony, I'm just gonna all that is absolutely correct, and I would agree with you. I haven't seen studies, but some of these things are increasing cognitive load when driving, so that's clearly a bad thing. There are changes, though, in urban planning that are positive, making more walkable communities, for example. The notion of being more age-friendly and more dementia-friendly communities. So that we can integrate people with dementia more seamlessly into our communities, try to remove stigma associated with the diagnosis. And some of these things may facilitate more walking, for example, which is a good thing for a number of reasons, of course, and may help promote alternative transportation or community shuttle buses, because we're concerned about the environment and the impact of vehicles. So looking to have less individuals driving themselves. So I'm hopeful that we will be thoughtful in our urban planning moving forward to develop things in a way that may actually help rather than hurt us with respect to this challenging issue.
That's great. As a bit of a segue, one of the viewer questions that came in ties in, Mark, with your comment about sort of the autonomous vehicles and technologies. The question is, are there any digital tools, apps, or technologies that are being used to facilitate safe driving by people with dementia?
So we are embarking on another study. We're trying to get funding for another study that builds off some work that's going on in America and Australia, using in-vehicle technology. So right now, if you want to get an objective view about how someone with dementia is driving, you would need to get them an on-road test. These are very expensive, these specialized on-road tests. So is there an alternative? We are exploring the idea of putting in cameras and sensors in cars that can allow us to create a signature that lets us know when driving might become unsafe, and to try to use that as a tool for family members to monitor their loved one with dementia. People already use, in some circumstances, they use cameras and security systems to deal with wandering issues in dementia. Can we do something similar for someone in early stage dementia to monitor their driving, and then to use that as a tool for the healthcare provider to communicate with the patient and their the person with dementia and their family about these issues, and get some objective real world data, not just hypothetical. Show us on this technology what can be used. This is not available at this point for widespread use, but we are trying to get some funding to study this further.
That sounds fascinating. It reminds me a little bit as well about the potential sort of teaching or feedback value from that. So I guess you could also sort of personalize or tailor tips for improving driving, obviously not just for people with dementia, but in this case, in this scenario, you could say, hey, we notice, at this time of day, you tend to, veer this far in the lanes. You might want to compensate this way, or you struggle on left turns after 6 p.m. Consider mapping out a route where you don't have to make a left turn through an intersection. But that would be interesting.
Anthony, just a couple of quick comments. This isn't technology, but what a lot of people don't realize is adults, including older adults, can go to driving schools and get an assessment of their driving by one of the driving instructors. And that can be quite helpful because they can identify what they see as either bad habits or aspects of your driving that may put you at more risk, and work with you to try to improve them. And the costs of doing that are considerably less than one of these specialized assessments with an occupational therapist. It's not high tech, but it can be helpful. But I did want to point out, although I'm not aware of specific technology, digital technology or apps or things to help people be safe to drive, there have been a variety of types of education, including digital, to try to improve various aspects of people's cognition, like their attention or their executive function or their memory, for example.
Like brain training apps, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the things that studies have showed, unfortunately, is sometimes these things can have a slight positive impact on the particular aspect they're trying to train, but the translation of that into actual functional activities has been poor to date. So, you might be able to improve someone's memory through these memory games and things, but then they try to see, does that translate into function? And so far, there's been very little that's been demonstrated in terms of translating that into actual function. And there's continued efforts in that, because obviously that's what we'd like to achieve. But at least to date, I haven't seen much that's translated well into actual functioning.
Yeah, because in that scenario, then you could have a driving simulator where people could, either identify deficits or practice. And I think there's been some work done on using driving simulators as part of a assessment of fitness to drive for efficiency purposes. But I guess it cuts both ways. If the practice doesn't generalize to improve someone's driving, there may be inaccuracies in the assessment of fitness to drive using a simulator. But
there's a few things, and you've hit one of the.
Oh, I think you hit the mute
Sorry,
button.
if you've driven in a simulator, it can feel pretty artificial. It certainly has a very different feel to it. So that's a bit of a challenge. with respect to that. But there is another aspect that people may be less aware of, which is it's called simulation sickness, which is people who try to drive in a simulator may develop a variety of symptoms that make it difficult for them to do that. And that there does seem to be an increased occurrence of this in older adults. So there may be many people who can't really tolerate the environment because the brain is telling them that they're moving, but their vestibular organs is telling them that they're not, and that can create nausea and other symptoms that can make it difficult. So it's less than ideal for a variety of ways, but your point is well taken. I think there will be continued work to see how simulated environments can assist people perhaps in either assessing their driving or improving some of their skills.
I want to follow up on one of the things you said about potentially going to, a driving instructor for, tips and I think one of the things that often will, inhibit an older adult from any type of assessment is the concern that somebody's going to find them unfit to drive and sort of take away their license. So is there any risk of that happening if you sort of book an appointment with a driving school instructor?
So that's a great question. Certainly I can answer that for Ontario, but I think it's probably true in most jurisdictions. Driving instructors are not a group that are recognized by driving authorities as having requirements to report. So generally speaking, that's not the case. It's an interesting question, Anthony, because you'd sort of like to believe that if someone's unsafe to drive, it's kind of important for them to find that out. And since these driving instructors really, it's in their best interest actually to keep you driving and maybe offer you some educational sessions, because that's how they make a living. They're disinclined. That's not likely, but they will be able to point out to the person with dementia and their carers maybe that there are areas of concern. And I'd like to encourage us to, I think one of the big problems in this area is a lack of public education. Because I'm pretty sure you're aware, Anthony, but our viewers may not be, that if you live long enough, you almost certainly will not be able to drive until the end of your life. And was a great paper that was published that said, on average, people who live beyond the age of 70 will experience somewhere between about 4 and 6 years before the end of their life that they will not be able to drive because of medical conditions that they will develop that will impact their driving. But I find that there is so little education about that. People think they're going to drive until the day before they pass on. And I think we could do a lot better at educating the public about this reality. And it's not just dementia, right? It can be eye disease. It could be their diabetes. It can be a variety of things. But we haven't educated the public that you are going to have to retire from driving if you live long enough because of medical conditions. And we have to make it less of, it's the most horrific thing that can happen to you, because we'll work with you to help make sure that you have alternatives to allow you to do the things that you want to do.
Gary, if in your scenario, though, if the person goes for a driving test at a commercial driving agency like that, and they and their family member tell you as their doctor that they failed, wouldn't that be a circumstance? Because Dr. Levinson was asking about wouldn't there be is there a risk of being reported on the basis of that if they tell you that they failed?
But the driving schools, they do not assess them in the context of a pass-fail.
Correct. Yes.
They would never say that they failed. They're assessing them with respect to their skills, areas of weakness, areas of strengths, and trying to give them tips as to how to improve. So that it never gets presented that way to them. So that won't occur.
That's right. But if they do say there's very serious concerns that they've shared, then that could then lead to
Right, and that's what should happen though,
yes,
because right, if there's serious concerns, it needs to be taken seriously, and maybe it means that they should not be driving. So I think anyway, it's a good thing. But
So we have one last question that came in, and it's from a person, a spouse whose partner is getting a diagnosis and of dementia. Was informed by the doctor that he will need to retire from driving. And the person feels that this is the right thing to do. But the question they had was, the person living with dementia still drives very well. And is that unusual that you may have dementia but still drive very well? And is there some kind of specific protocol with respect to advising the Minister of Transport when it comes to dementia?
So the
so
minister,
Mark, if I could say something quickly, I'm going to turn it over to you. One of the things I want to point out is much of driving is very reflexive. So when there's nothing going on and there's no problems, all of us have had the circumstance, we've driven somewhere, we've arrived, and we've almost completely blacked. We cannot remember almost how we got there because it's so routinized and reflexive, right? The problem is when people have dementia, issues around decision-making, judgment, ability to quickly respond to circumstances may be significantly impacted. So it may be harder to pick up those things under routine driving. So it may appear that things may be better than they actually are in certain circumstances. So that may be an element to this, but I'll let Mark.
yeah, and statistically speaking, people with dementia are at double the risk of motor vehicle crash. And I really like Gary's answer about how routinized everything gets.
Yeah.
And it's when there's a crisis. The issue about protocol about reporting, that varies from province to province. On our website, we have links to each of the provinces so you can find out the details in your province. In Ontario, there's a combination of mandatory and discretionary reporting. In BC, one must report people who have been told not to drive and continue to drive. There are nuances in various, and most provinces have some form of mandatory reporting. In some provinces, it is discretionary.
And I guess to one of your earlier points, basically anybody who is diagnosed with a dementia at a moderate stage, it's like 100% likely that their healthcare provider should report that to the Ministry of Transportation. There's a bit of a gray zone and more of a judgment call with respect to the earliest stages or in mild cognitive impairment. And I think some of your research shows many people with mild or early dementia are still driving, and while there are increased risks and it's important to watch, not everybody with a diagnosis of dementia is necessarily unfit to
Correct,
drive.
but everyone with, I guess our corollary to that is everyone with even mild dementia or even MCI should start making plans.
Yes.
Proactively about when will they know and how will they decide to stop driving, because it's
and actually that's a good final segue to in addition to the drivinganddementia.ca website, this is an e-learning lesson that is on our McMaster Optimal Aging portal that is not geared towards people living with dementia, but talks more generally at some of the issues that Gary highlighted, like the importance of thinking about and planning for retiring from driving for all manner of reasons. So and I do also just want to highlight that these live events would not be possible without donations. So if you're on the iGeriCare.ca website, our donation button is in the top right corner. I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate you coming. This is a fantastic resource at the drivinganddementia.ca, the Driving and Dementia Roadmap. I want to thank Doctors Mark Rapoport and Gary Naglie for joining us today for a great conversation and discussion, and really use that website resource. That's what it's there for. Also want to thank the support for iGeriCare from the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, or CABI, powered by Baycrest, as well as the Jaris Center at Hamilton Health Sciences, McMaster University, the Hamilton Health Sciences Foundation, our Alzheimer's Society Foundation of Hamilton Halton, and our Division of E-Learning Innovation team. As always, teamwork makes the dream work. Everybody have a safe holiday. There's a survey in the comments in our YouTube channel. The link to the drivinganddementia.ca website is also there. Cast your votes for future conversations. Mark, Gary, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us join you.
Thanks so much. Great job facilitating, and thanks to the audience. Much appreciated.
Take care, everybody. Safe holidays.